Oprah mocked John Kennedy's faith on live TV. His response left her speechless. The Harpo Studios stage gleamed under the glow of massive studio lights, its polished floors and plush velvet chairs exuding an air of sophistication. At the center of it all sat Oprah Winfrey, America's media titan, a woman whose voice had shaped culture, inspired millions, and turned heartfelt conversations into a global empire. Today, she was hosting a much-hyped special titled Spirituality in the New Age, a showcase of big ideas featuring religious leaders, motivational speakers, and influential figures. The audience buzzed with anticipation, their applause echoing through the cavernous studio as the cameras rolled broadcasting live to millions. But beneath Oprah's warm smile and practiced charm lay a calculated plan, one known only to her and her inner circle of producers, to challenge the Christian faith of her special guest, Senator John Neely Kennedy from Louisiana. With her razor-sharp wit and media savvy, Oprah believed she could corner Kennedy, a man known for his blunt honesty and conservative values, and make him squirm before a global audience. What she didn't know was that this day, this moment, would turn the tables in ways she could never have imagined. As John Kennedy stepped onto the stage, he carried an unshakable calm. His navy suit, neatly tailored but unflashy, spoke of a man who valued substance over show. In his jacket pocket rested a small Bible, not for display, but as a quiet reminder of why he was here. The audience clapped politely, but there was a palpable tension in the air, a mix of curiosity and expectation. They knew Kennedy wasn't your average politician. He was the kind of man who spoke openly about his Christian faith, even when it earned him accusations of being old-fashioned or divisive. Oprah greeted him with her trademark warmth, her smile as inviting as ever, though her eyes betrayed a glint of calculation. "Senator Kennedy, it's an honor to have you with us today," she said, her voice smooth and welcoming, the kind that could put anyone at ease. "We're in for a fascinating conversation about spirituality, hope, and what guides us through life." Kennedy nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Thank you, Oprah. I'm glad to be here," he replied, his voice low and warm, laced with the unmistakable drawl of Louisiana's bayou country. He settled into his chair, hands resting lightly on his knees, his posture relaxed but alert. In his heart, though he knew this was no ordinary interview, he'd heard about Oprah's ventures into spirituality, her high-priced courses, her partnerships with New Age gurus, her knack for turning ancient wisdom into profitable products. He hadn't come to judge her, but he wasn't about to back down if the truth was at stake. Before arriving, he'd prayed quietly, asking God for wisdom and courage to speak what needed to be said, no matter the cost. This wasn't about winning a debate. It was about standing for something bigger. Oprah started with soft questions, easing the audience into the conversation. She asked about Kennedy's work in the Senate, how he connected with the people of Louisiana, and the challenges of navigating a polarized political landscape. Kennedy answered with sincerity, tossing in a touch of Southern humor that drew chuckles from the crowd. His stories about meeting constituents, farmers, teachers, small-town preachers, painted a picture of a man grounded in his roots. But Oprah wasn't here for small talk. She shifted gears, her tone sharpening just enough to signal a change. "Senator," she said, her smile still in place, but her eyes narrowing slightly, "you often talk about your Christian faith in your speeches. You've said it's the cornerstone of your life. But in a diverse world like ours, where people find meaning in so many different ways, isn't it a bit outdated to insist there's only one path to God?" The question landed like a well-aimed dart, striking at the heart of Kennedy's publicly professed Christianity. The audience fell silent, their eyes darting between Oprah and Kennedy, waiting for his response. Some leaned forward, intrigued by the challenge. In a culture that prized inclusivity and open-mindedness, the idea of one exclusive path to God felt rigid, almost confrontational. Oprah knew this, and she was banking on it. She expected Kennedy to either defend his beliefs and come off as narrow-minded, or soften his stance and undermine his own faith. It was a trap, and she was confident she'd set it perfectly. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He met Oprah's gaze, then turned to the audience, his eyes warm and steady, the kind of look that made you feel seen. "Oprah, let me tell you about a woman named Mary from Baton Rouge." He began, his voice slow and deliberate, carrying the weight of a storyteller who knows his tale matters. Mary's a single mom, lost her husband in a car accident a few years back. She's raising 3 kids on a cashier's paycheck, barely scraping by. Life hasn't been kind to her. But every morning, she sits at her kitchen table and prays. Not for money or an easier life, but for strength to keep going. She told me her faith in Jesus is the only thing that gets her through the light in her darkest days. The story hit the room like a quiet thunderclap. The audience, accustomed to lofty spiritual rhetoric or polished sound bites, felt the raw truth of Mary's struggle. A few people dabbed at their eyes, moved by the simplicity of Kennedy's words. Oprah, though still smiling, hadn't expected this. She'd prepared for a theological sparring match, not a personal story that grounded faith in the grit of everyday life. She jumped in quickly, trying to steer the conversation back to her terms. "That's a beautiful story, Senator," she said, her tone carrying a hint of condescension, as if gently correcting a wayward guest. "But my question wasn't about personal experiences. I'm asking whether your faith, with its claim that there's only one way to God, is appropriate to impose on a diverse society where people have the right to choose their own spiritual paths." The question was sharper now, more pointed, designed to put Kennedy on the defensive. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement with Oprah. She was, after all, the champion of open-hearted spirituality, the woman who'd brought meditation, mindfulness, and self-help gurus into mainstream America. Kennedy, with his unapologetic Christianity, seemed to stand in opposition to that ethos of acceptance. But Kennedy didn't take the bait. He nodded, acknowledging the question's weight, then leaned forward slightly. "Oprah, I'm not imposing anything on anybody," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not here to force anyone to believe what I do. But you asked about my faith, and I've got to be honest. Jesus said, 'I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.' Those aren't my words. They're His. If I believe that it's my duty to share it, not to bully folks, but to invite them. People can choose what they want, but I can't stay quiet about what I know to be true." The words landed with a force that silenced the room. The audience sat still, absorbing the conviction in Kennedy's voice. Some clapped softly, not out of blind agreement, but out of respect for his courage. He hadn't attacked anyone or raised his voice yet. His words carried a clarity that cut through the haze of vague spirituality. Oprah, for the first time in her storied career, felt the ground shift beneath her. She'd expected to control this exchange, to guide it toward her vision of inclusive, marketable spirituality. But Kennedy, with his quiet resolve, was turning this into something else, a moment of truth that demanded attention. Sensing she was losing her grip, Oprah pressed harder, her voice taking on a steely edge. "Senator, you talk about absolute truth, about one way to God. But do you really believe that billions of people around the world who follow other faiths or none at all are wrong? Doesn't your faith make you judgmental of them?" The question was a masterstroke, a rhetorical landmine. If Kennedy said yes, he'd be painted as arrogant and intolerant. If he said no, he'd contradict his own beliefs. The audience leaned in the tension thick enough to choke on. Some shifted uncomfortably, others nodded in approval of Oprah's challenge. She was their icon, the voice of reason in a world of dogma, and they trusted her to expose any hint of hypocrisy. Kennedy paused, not out of uncertainty, but to gather his thoughts. He closed his eyes for a split second, a silent prayer for wisdom. Then he looked at Oprah, his gaze steady and kind. "Oprah, truth doesn't bend to numbers or feelings," he said, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. "If I believe a bridge is broken, I'm not going to tell folks to walk across it, no matter how much they believe it's safe. My faith isn't about judging people. It's about warning them and offering hope. I'm not saying everyone else is wrong just because they're different. I'm saying I've found a path, and I want to share it with anyone who'll listen." The analogy was simple, but devastating. The audience erupted in scattered applause, some clapping hesitantly, others with conviction. Even those who disagreed couldn't deny the power of Kennedy's sincerity. Oprah's smile tightened her composure, fraying at the edges. She hadn't anticipated this, a politician who didn't dodge or deflect, but met her challenge head-on with a blend of humility and resolve. "That's an interesting perspective, Senator," she said, her voice betraying a hint of strain. "We'll dive deeper into this after a quick break." As the stage lights dimmed and the show cut to commercial, Oprah glanced at Kennedy, her eyes a mix of frustration and reluctant admiration. She knew the next segment would be even more intense, and for the first time, she wasn't sure she'd come out on top. Kennedy, meanwhile, sat quietly, his gaze drifting to the audience, his heart whispering a prayer. The battle wasn't over, and what came next could change everything. The lights in Harpo Studios snapped back on, bathing the stage in a warm golden glow as the commercial break ended. The audience, still buzzing from the electric tension of the first segment, settled into their seats, their eyes locked on Oprah Winfrey and Senator John Neely Kennedy. What had started as a polished talk show special on spirituality in the New Age had morphed into something far more raw, a clash of worldviews that felt less like a discussion and more like a reckoning. Oprah, her composure slightly rattled by Kennedy's unflinching sincerity, knew she couldn't let him continue to steer the conversation. She'd built an empire on her ability to control narratives, to guide guests into her framework of inclusive, marketable spirituality. But Kennedy, with his quiet conviction and Southern drawl, was proving to be an immovable force. As the cameras rolled, Oprah leaned forward, her smile tight but professional, determined to regain the upper hand. What she didn't realize was that Kennedy's words were about to shake not just the studio, but the very foundation of her carefully constructed empire. "Welcome back, everyone," Oprah began, her voice smooth, but carrying a subtle edge like a blade wrapped in velvet. "We're here with Senator John Neely Kennedy, talking about faith, truth, and what it means to find meaning in today's world. Senator, you've shared some compelling thoughts about your Christian faith, and I appreciate your candor." She paused, letting the audience absorb her gracious tone, a signal that she was still in charge. "But let's get real for a moment. As a politician, you've used your faith to connect with voters, to present yourself as a man of principle. Some might say that's a form of manipulation, leveraging people's emotions to win their trust. How do you respond to that?" The question was a grenade lobbed with precision to undermine Kennedy's integrity. The audience stirred, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. In the world of politics, accusations of exploiting faith for votes were as old as time, and Oprah knew it. She was banking on Kennedy stumbling either by getting defensive or dodging the question, which would make him look like just another opportunistic politician. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every micro-expression on his face. But Kennedy didn't blink. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, its edges worn from handling. He held it up briefly, not for show, but as if it grounded him, then set it on his knee. "Oprah," he said, his voice steady and warm, "let me tell you about a boy named Tommy from New Orleans." The audience leaned in, caught off guard by the shift. Kennedy's tone was soft, but commanding, the kind that made you hang on every word. "Tommy's 10 years old," he continued, "and he's been in and out of the hospital for most of his life. Leukemia. His mama wrote me a letter a while back. Said Tommy watched one of my speeches on TV. I'd talked about faith, about how God's love gives us hope, even when the world feels like it's falling apart. Tommy grabbed his mama's hand and said, 'Mama, if that man says God loves me, I ain't scared anymore.'" Kennedy paused, his eyes sweeping the audience not for effect, but because he wanted them to feel Tommy's story. "I didn't tell that story to win votes, Oprah. I told it because kids like Tommy and folks like his mama need something real to hold on to. My faith isn't a tool. It's why I do what I do." The studio fell silent, the weight of Kennedy's words settling over the crowd like a heavy fog. A few audience members wiped tears from their eyes, their faces soft with emotion. Others nodded, as if Tommy's story had unlocked something deep within them. Oprah, caught off guard, felt a flicker of unease. She'd expected a political dodge, not a story that cut straight to the heart. Her empire was built on stories, on connecting with people's emotions. But Kennedy's tale wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was raw, unfiltered, and undeniably real. She recovered quickly, her media training kicking in. "That's a powerful story, Senator," she said, her voice measured, but with a hint of strain. "And I don't doubt that it resonates with many people. But let's broaden the conversation. You emphasize one-path Christianity as the truth. Don't you think that's a limited perspective in a global world where people find meaning through countless spiritual traditions?" The question was a pivot, a way to pull the discussion back to safer, more abstract ground. Oprah was the queen of framing spirituality as a universal tapestry where all paths, Buddhism, meditation, self-help, led to the same destination. Kennedy's insistence on one truth threatened that vision, and she needed to expose its flaws. The audience murmured in agreement, some nodding as if Oprah had voiced their own thoughts. Kennedy, however, didn't hesitate. He leaned back slightly, his hands clasped, and gave her a look that was both respectful and unflinching. "Oprah, I respect that folks find meaning in all sorts of ways," he said. "I'm not here to tell anybody they can't search for truth wherever they want. But let me ask you something. If you knew a child was about to walk into a burning building, would you tell them there are lots of ways to get out, or would you point them to the one safe exit?" The analogy hit like a thunderbolt. The audience gasped softly, some clapping, before they even realized it. Kennedy's words were simple but piercing, cutting through the fog of relativism with a clarity that was both disarming and profound. He wasn't attacking other beliefs. He was making a case for urgency for truth as a matter of life and death. Oprah's smile faltered for a split second, her mind racing to find a counterpoint. She hadn't expected him to turn the question back on her, and the audience's reaction, scattered applause, nods of understanding, told her she was losing ground. "That's a vivid metaphor, Senator," she said, her tone clipped but still professional. "But you're sidestepping the issue. My work, my courses, my books, they've helped millions find peace and purpose. Are you saying that's meaningless just because it doesn't align with your faith?" The question was a trap designed to paint Kennedy as dismissive of her legacy. If he criticized her work, he'd alienate the audience who revered Oprah as a beacon of hope. If he endorsed it, he'd dilute his own message. The crowd leaned forward, sensing the stakes. Kennedy paused, not out of hesitation, but to choose his words carefully. He looked at Oprah, his eyes filled with a compassion that caught her off guard. "Oprah," he said softly, "I don't doubt you've helped folks feel better. Your kindness, your encouragement, that's real and it matters. But feeling better isn't the same as being saved. Your courses might ease someone's pain for a while, but they can't answer the big questions. Why are we here? What happens when we die? My faith says only Jesus has those answers, and I'd be lying if I said anything else." The studio went quiet, the kind of silence that feels sacred. Kennedy's words weren't harsh, but they were unrelenting, exposing the gap between temporary comfort and eternal truth. The audience, many of whom had spent thousands on Oprah's miracle mindset classes or self-help retreats, felt a stirring in their hearts. They'd been sold promises of peace and abundance, but Kennedy was offering something different, something free yet infinitely costly. Oprah, for the first time in her career, felt exposed. Her empire rested on the idea that spirituality could be packaged and sold, but Kennedy's faith was a direct challenge to that model. She tried to rally her voice, rising slightly. "Senator, you're talking about salvation as if it's exclusive to your beliefs. But what about the wisdom of other traditions? What about the billions who find joy and meaning outside Christianity? Are they all misguided?" The audience clapped, emboldened by Oprah's pushback. She was their champion, the woman who'd taught them to embrace all paths to find divinity within themselves. Kennedy, with his unyielding stance, seemed to threaten that freedom. But Kennedy didn't back down. He reached for the folded paper on his knee, holding it like a talisman. "Oprah, I'm not here to argue about who's right or wrong," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "I'm here to share what I know. When I was younger, I looked for answers everywhere. Books, philosophies, you name it. But nothing filled the hole in my heart until I met Jesus. Not a religion, not a system, but a person who said, 'Come to me, and I'll give you rest.' That's not arrogance. That's surrender. I'm just a man who found a lifeline, and I want to throw it to anyone who's drowning." The words landed like a tidal wave, washing over the audience with a force that left them breathless. Some clapped, others sat stunned, their minds wrestling with the weight of what they'd heard. Kennedy wasn't preaching. He was testifying, and the difference was palpable. Oprah, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair, felt a crack forming in her carefully curated facade. She'd spent decades building a spiritual empire, selling hope at a premium, but Kennedy's message was free, unpolished, and piercingly honest. The audience was no longer just watching her. They were looking at him, hanging on his every word. For the first time, she felt the spotlight shift. Desperate to reclaim control, Oprah went for a final blow. "Senator," she said, her voice sharp now, "your faith is clearly important to you. But let's be honest. You're a public figure, a man with influence. When you talk about Jesus as the only way, you're not just sharing a personal belief. You're shaping how people think, how they vote, how they live. Isn't that a kind of power you're wielding, maybe even a dangerous one?" The accusation was bold, implying that Kennedy's faith was a tool of control, a way to manipulate the masses. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others waiting to see how he'd respond. Kennedy looked at Oprah, his eyes soft but unwavering. "Oprah," he said, "power's a funny thing. You can use it to build yourself up, or you can use it to lift others. My faith isn't about control, It's about freedom. Freedom from fear, from guilt, from chasing things that don't last. I talk about Jesus because I've seen what he does for people like Tommy, like Mary, like me. If that's power, it's not mine, it's his. He held up the folded paper, his voice growing quieter but more intense. This is a letter from Tommy's mama. She sent it last week, thanking me for giving her boy hope. That's why I'm here, Oprah. Not to win an argument, but to point people to the one who can carry them through. The studio erupted in applause, not the polite clapping of earlier, but a genuine outpouring of emotion. People were crying, nodding, some even whispering prayers. Oprah sat frozen, her face pale as the realization hit her. She wasn't just losing the debate. She was losing the audience. Kennedy's words had done what her empire never could. They'd touched something deeper, something eternal. As the segment ended and the show cut to another break, Oprah looked at Kennedy, her eyes a mix of defeat and dawning respect. She knew the final segment would be a turning point, not just for the show, but for her own heart. Kennedy, meanwhile, folded the letter and tucked it back into his pocket, his heart steady. The battle wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. As the final segment of the Spirituality in the New Age special began, Harpo Studios felt like a sacred space, the air thick with anticipation and unspoken questions. The audience, still reeling from the raw intensity of Senator John Neely Kennedy's words, sat in rapt silence, their eyes darting between him and Oprah Winfrey. What had started as a polished talk show had become a profound confrontation, not just of ideas, but of hearts. Oprah, her usual confidence shaken by Kennedy's unyielding sincerity, knew she was at a crossroads. She could double down, try to reclaim her narrative, or confront the unease stirring within her. The cameras rolled, capturing every moment, but the real drama was unfolding in the quiet spaces between words, in fleeting glances, in the hearts of those watching. Kennedy, his small Bible resting in his pocket, sat calmly, his face a portrait of compassion and resolve. This was no longer about winning. It was about truth, and what it might cost them both. Oprah took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Senator Kennedy," she began, her voice softer now, stripped of its earlier edge, "you've given us a lot to think about. Your faith, your stories, they're powerful. But I want to understand something." She paused, her eyes searching his face as if looking for an anchor. "How can you be so certain that your way, your Jesus, is the only truth? I've spent my life helping people find peace through all kinds of paths: meditation, self-discovery, ancient wisdom. Are you saying all of that is wrong?" The question wasn't a trap this time. It was a plea, raw and vulnerable. The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift. Oprah, the unshakable queen of media, was showing a crack in her armor, and they were witnessing it live. Kennedy's eyes softened, but his gaze held steady. He reached for the folded letter from Tommy's mother, not to show it, but to ground himself. "Oprah," he said, his voice low and warm like a pastor speaking to a weary soul. "I'm not here to tear down what you've built. I'm not saying every path is wrong. I'm saying I found the one that's right, not because I'm smarter or better, but because it found me. When I was lost, Jesus didn't ask me to earn my way to him. He met me where I was broken and all. That's not a theory. It's a lifeline." He leaned forward slightly, his words deliberate. "You've helped folks find peace, and that's good. But peace that fades when the course ends or the money runs out isn't enough. We need hope that lasts forever, and I believe only Jesus gives that." The audience was silent, but their faces told the story. Some nodded, others wiped tears, A few sat with furrowed brows, wrestling with the weight of his words. Oprah's hands trembled slightly, her mind racing. She'd spent decades crafting a spiritual empire, selling hope through courses and books, convincing millions they could find divinity within themselves. But Kennedy's words, simple yet unyielding, exposed a truth she'd avoided. Her empire offered comfort, but not salvation. She tried to respond, her voice catching. "Senator, I've helped millions. I've seen lives change. Are you saying that doesn't matter because it's not your faith?" Her tone was defensive, but beneath it lay a deeper question. What if I've been wrong? Kennedy didn't pounce. Instead, he smiled gently, the kind of smile that disarms without dismissing. "Oprah, what you've done matters. Kindness always does. But the question isn't whether you've helped people feel better, it's whether you've pointed them to the one who can make them whole. Jesus didn't come to make us comfortable, he came to make us new. That's the difference." His words landed like a quiet thunderclap, and the audience felt it. Some clapped softly, others sat in stunned silence, their own spiritual searches reflected in the moment. Oprah's face crumpled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time, she saw herself not as the giver of hope, but as someone who'd been selling a substitute for it. In a moment that would be replayed millions of times, Oprah stood her legs unsteady. "Senator," she said, her voice breaking, "I've built my life on helping people. But if I've been pointing them to the wrong thing, what does that make me?" The admission hung in the air, raw and devastating. The audience gasped, their hero revealing a vulnerability they'd never seen. Kennedy stood too, not to claim victory, but to meet her where she was. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice steady but tender. "Oprah, it makes you human, just like the rest of us. The good news is, Jesus doesn't need you to have it all figured out. He takes your mistakes, your broken pieces, and makes something beautiful. That's grace." Tears streamed down Oprah's face, and she didn't try to hide them. The audience, many crying too, watched in awe, as their icon knelt not in defeat, but in surrender. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I've always been in control." Kennedy knelt beside her, his voice a lifeline. "That's where he wants you out of answers, ready to listen. That's where we all start." He looked out at the audience, his eyes shining with compassion. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." That's not about money. It's about knowing you need him. That's where freedom begins. The studio felt transformed, as if the pretense of performance had melted away. Kennedy prayed quietly, not for show, but with a sincerity that drew others in. "Jesus, here's your daughter. Oprah, she's tired of carrying the weight alone. Show her your love, your truth, your rest." Oprah sobbed, not the polished tears of a TV moment, but the raw release of a heart breaking open. The audience joined in some praying, others simply holding space for the sacredness of it all. As the show ended, there was no fanfare, no music, just a reverent hush. Oprah stood, her face softer, her eyes clearer. "I don't know what this means for my work," she said, her voice honest, "but I know I can't go back to pretending I have all the answers." The audience applauded gently, not for entertainment, but for courage. In the months that followed, Oprah made a stunning announcement. She was ending her spiritual courses, redirecting her resources to quiet acts of service, visiting hospitals, supporting families, sharing the hope she'd found. Kennedy continued his work in the Senate, his faith unchanged, but his humility deepened. The lesson. This story teaches us that truth spoken with love can pierce even the hardest hearts. True faith doesn't need flash or profit. It thrives in humility and action. In a world chasing quick fixes, Kennedy's stand reminds us to seek what lasts: love, grace, and a Savior who meets us where we are. Ask yourself, what are you holding on to? And are you brave enough to let truth reshape it? The path to freedom starts with a single honest step.